Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So this is chapter 19, and I'm going to be going over the chapter this week, and we also have a quiz this week. It's module 12, and so I'm going to be going through the quiz answers at the same time, and I'm going to start my clock, and I always go over, but I'll try to keep it short and just concentrate on the quiz. Although this is a huge chapter. So before I get started, I just want to tell you up front that it is November 12th, 2023, and I mention that because the Israel-Hamas war just started in October, a month ago, and we're going to talk about a few things that are relevant to the Middle East and the formation of Israel in this chapter. So it's particularly important when you're considering today's events. So let's go ahead and get started. If you look at the date on this chapter, 1910 to 1939, and the topic, what does it tell us? Well, it tells us there was a global crisis. We know that. But also, if we know our history, we know that between 1910 and 1939, is really all about World War I, that time frame. Okay, the 19 teens is World War I. So you don't have to remember the exact date, but that's sort of why the periodization of this chapter is what it is. So it takes you to really the events that lead up to World War I, and then what happens after World War I. Okay, World War II doesn't start yet in this chapter, so keep that in mind. So let's get started. World War I, the first part of this chapter kind of talks about all of the disruptions and like weird things going on in the world at this time. Okay, so as you go through the first part, the thing to look about, because they're kind of giving you a summary here, is look at the different visions of the world, sort of what's going on prior to World War I. And really, there was sort of a competition for ideas about liberal democracy, like in the U.S., and authoritarianism, and also anti-colonialism. So these are the kind of three threads that are running through this time period. And the anti-colonial piece is really a big deal, because when we learn about who got into World War I and why, we learn about the Ottoman Empire, which is this huge Muslim empire, the entire Middle East by today's standards. And it's like, why the heck are they getting into this sort of industrial Western, World War I part or piece? Or why are the people in Africa or colonial, all the colonies in Africa being brought into that? And that's exactly why, because a lot of these areas were under the control of England or France, all right, and they'd had it up to here with that. So when the Great War started and countries like Germany were fighting England and France, of course the Muslims wanted to get in on that side, because they wanted to rise up against their colonial masters. So yeah, I just wanted to set that up as a historical window or context to this chapter, because otherwise you keep wondering, well, why did these people fight in the first place? Which is always a good question, because wars never make sense. But just sort of keep that in mind. And at the end of the war, we'll also see this idea of anti-colonial backlash, and also the rise of authoritarian regimes with the Russian Revolution that starts in 1917. Or around there, as we'll learn as we go through the chapter. So World War I, let's get right to it. One of the quiz questions, I don't know why I skipped there, but one of the quiz questions is, and I'll look at it right now, is what caused World War I? Well, you really can't ask that or answer that in one quiz question, but I did. And the answer on our quiz is what caused World War I? Well, the biggest thing was right here, and it's highlighted in blue, underlying European tensions between these great rivalries. And the rivalries were Germany, a rising Germany, and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. And Russia wasn't in it for the whole time; they dropped out early. But anyway, that's kind of why there's there's discontent and territorial disputes between these great power rivals. And if you've taken history in high school, you probably heard about the shot heard around the world that started World War I, where a Serbian prince gets shot, and that's really like a spark that kind of makes these tensions explode. Okay, so in the quiz, make sure you know what caused World War I, or what was one of the starting points. It was ongoing European tensions between these great rivalries in Europe. So we got that one covered. And let's kind of go through and look at it. So one of the things the chapter talks about is trench warfare and why World War I was different. And the reason it was different is really it was the first big industrial war. And by that I mean using industrial tools like automatic weapons and tanks and poison gas for the first time. So that's why it kind of had to be trench warfare, because all of the armies at that time were using tactics that were back from the sword fighting days, where you'd line up in a line and just sort of push your enemy back. And all of a sudden with automatic weapons, you couldn't do that anymore because millions of people would get killed, which they did. And that's why it was trench warfare, because the tactics of the old way were not working anymore with these modern weapons. And as you'll read, these trenches, moved a little bit at a time and gained some territory and lost hundreds of thousands of men, in days. And, if you read about like the Battle of the Somme and some of these other battles in France, the number of guys that die per day on both sides is just stunning. And then you find out that France loses like 75% of its men between the ages of, I think, 15 and 45 or something like that, some ridiculous number, horrors of war that we couldn't even imagine in our lifetime. So World War I was really different because it was industrial, it was devastating, and it was originally caused by the conflicts between these European powers. Okay, so it talks about carnage, and it shows you these neat maps of the battle lines and how little they moved. But I want to stop here for a minute because there's a question on the quiz about the Ottoman Empire and why they entered World War I. And I hinted about that in the beginning. And the Ottoman Empire, which is like the entire Islam, it's all Muslim Middle East at that time, for lack of a better way to describe it, they wanted to get into World War I. They wanted to fight against British and the French because they were colonized by the British and the French, and they had it up to here with colonial rule, right? So when the Ottoman Empire had an opportunity to join the war on the side of the Germans, they declared this Islamic jihad against the Western powers. And so make sure you make a note of that as you're reading this chapter, or as you're listening to this lecture, or as you're taking the quiz, because that's a quiz question. Why did the Muslim world, why did the Ottoman Empire, join World War I on the side of the Germans? And it was really so they would have an opportunity to get back at their colonial masters. And I think it's really important as we think about today's history and sort of these deep-seated hatred, if you will, or disputes between the West and the Middle East often. This is not something new. It goes back to, prior to World War I and the colonial times, and how the West just kind of came in and took over stuff, not more than 100 years ago, or not that much longer than 100 years ago. So that's a quiz question. Make sure you know that. And then let's just kind of go through. So really what we're still talking here is about why people got into the war. So we just talked about the Ottoman forces, all right, and the Ottomans also used this as an opportunity to wipe out a bunch of Armenians who were also their enemies. There's a little bit in here about how many soldiers were died over 4 years. Military deaths exceeded 9 million. So there you go, when we talked about how brutal this was. The other thing to keep in mind, and it was going to be a quiz question, but it's not, but it's, why did women get the right to vote right around this time? In the U.S., it was 1920. In these other countries, 1915, 1917, 1918, 1918. It's all because women all of a sudden were empowered during the war because they were building weapons while the men were out fighting. The women were running everything, the factories, the economy, and everything else. So when the war was over, they were like, hey, we ran everything, we want some rights. So that's really why the women's rights movement starts in earnest, and it really starts with the women's suffrage movement back in the 1900s. Pretty cool history there. So make sure you know that. I'm just kind of looking through my notes to make sure I get the quiz question. All right, so this talks all about mobilization during the war. Read about the Russian Revolution in 1917. I do not believe there's a quiz question about it, but it's interesting because this is really the start of communism, Leninism and then Stalinism, but for lack of a a better word. This is really the start of communist Russia, when Trotsky and Lenin overthrow, basically take over, the government. The czar is overthrown. The old monarchy, if you will, is overthrown. The Romanov family is thrown out and exiled or killed. And so all of a sudden, the Bolsheviks take over for a while, and then Lenin and Trotsky come in, and they're really trying to impose a form of Marxism. That's what they're trying to do in Russia, and it's really sort of a bastardized version, and so we kind of call it Leninism in the trade, sort of a command and control, authoritarian government that really just it totally ruins the country, because they decide to, like, all the farmers have to give their crops to the government, and there's starvation and terrible things going on. So the Russian Revolution is this sort of horrendous experience for the peasants, which is what most of Russia was during this time. But it is important because it's sort of the beginning of authoritarian Russia, which really hasn't changed in the past 100 and some years since the Russian Revolution. So read about that, and I just want to see here real quick. I'm looking at the quiz. Yeah, so make sure you know about the Russian Revolution. There's no quiz questions directly about it. One of the reasons that the U.S. gets into the war, and I don't know if a lot of you know this or not, there's a couple of reasons the U.S. get into World War I. We're really against it. Woodrow Wilson's the president at the time, and he doesn't want to get into the war. No one in the U.S. is particularly interested. We're not prepared. We really don't have that strong of an army at that point in time. But we build up fast, and a couple of things happen. So the first thing is something called the Zimmerman telegram, and you'll read about it in your textbook. But if you don't know about it, it's a cool story. So it turns out, and so this is again, you don't have to remember the date, all right? But it turns out in the 1917, I guess, the U.S. intercepts this telegram that's going from Germany to Mexico, the Zimmerman telegram, and it's basically promising Mexico that, hey, if you get into the war with us, all right, once we win the war, we will give you back all the territory in the U.S. that was taken from you in 1848, which was Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, some of Oregon. I mean, it was like all of the West. So anyway, the U.S. intercepts the Zimmerman telegram, and it's Germany trying to get Mexico. It's a telegram to Mexico. That's a quiz question. Trying to get Mexico into the war. So that's a big reason for the U.S. getting in. And the other bigger reason for the U.S. getting in is that a couple of our ships, or a couple of Americans died, and a couple of American merchant ships were sunk by German submarines before the war. So that was the other reason. But on the quiz, it asks you about the Zimmerman telegram. So make sure you know that. We already talked about the Ottoman Empire, and we have two more things to do in this chapter. So this talks about the peace settlement and what's going on with that. And let me just go through. And the peace settlement's lame, all right, Treaty of Versailles. Basically, it causes World War II, but we'll get to that in another chapter. But read about it, because it punishes Germany and does all this stuff that's impossible. Here's what's going on in 1916, and this is kind of divvying up, all right, again, divvying up the Middle East by the colonial powers after World War I. So down here in this green, all right, down right up in here, this area is where Israel is today, all right? So you can see this was territory that was sort of recolonized after World War I, leading to trouble. So read that. And the other thing you're going to read about is this Balfour Declaration. I mentioned it before, and I mentioned 47, but I only got confused because of the creation of the country. But the Balfour Declaration is really it's 1917, and it's really important today because it's a quiz question, and it really leads to the creation of Israel. as an independent state for Jewish people in Palestine. All right, so when you read about the Zionist aspirations, the Zionist thing is like the Jewish state. All right, the Zionist movement. That's the movement for an independent Jewish state, for lack of a better way to say it. So make sure you read about this, and it's in the quiz, but I just want to, I mean, if you read nothing else, I'm just trying to find out, I don't know what page it's at, but it's near the end of the chapter, and read through it, because I think, you know, as you're thinking about events that are going on in the Middle East today, and again, I gave you a date, so I don't know what it's going to be like if we're watching this in the spring, but it kind of tells you about the beginning of Israel and how that's going to happen, like 30 years after the declaration or so. But you're going to learn more about it as you go through. So that's important, and that's on the quiz. And then lastly, real quick, you know, they talk about the rise of mass culture in this chapter a lot, and by that they mean, you know, we're all listening to the same radio station, we're all watching the same movies, we're all eating the same Big Macs at McDonald's. You know, this idea of mass society and the building of mass culture. So they talk about that in this chapter with the advent of radio. Okay, no TV yet, but radio was, you know, majorly cool in its day. Now we're back to podcasting, which is kind of back like radio again to me, but I'm old. So there's that, the rise of films and advertising, mass production and mass consumption, but and the rise of the assembly line and all that stuff. But the reason this is important is because as we learn about getting into World War II, we learn about, again, the power of propaganda and nationalism, and the way all of this stuff, I mean, movies are great to go watch, and radio's, you know, great to listen to, but if you're getting political messages from it, or if it's run by the government and they're feeding you whatever they want you to believe, then it's not so good. But kind of keep that in the back of your head. And also the other thing, not only mass consumption, but mass production leads not only to, hey, we can have cars for real cheap, which they talk about here with Henry Ford, which is really cool, but also, hey, these machines of war can be built really cheap. Like we can build a couple of 100,000 airplanes in no time. So there's these underlying nuances, and I hate to be too warlike, but there's these underlying nuances of this stuff that are going on that are going to fuel another industrial war that's coming up, World War II, in, I think, the next chapter, but not in this one. So the end of the war happens, war production stops. What happens? The Great Depression. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the reparations from the Treaty of Versailles are so severe to Germany that they can't pay back loans that they owe to the U.S., so they default on loans, and the U.S. production's all screwed up, and there's the stock market crash. So a lot of stuff goes on. The Dust Bowl, all right, for farmers in the U.S. So the Great Depression starts in the 1930s, and really these different ideas for visions of governments appear. The New Deal is this liberal democracy type thing in the U.S., which we really still live under today. You're going to read about Keynes or Keynesian economics a little bit in the chapter. But then the other thing is the rise of authoritarian states, because, you know, when society is bad, these cult-like figures can come in and say, I'm going to fix it. Everyone will say, all right, cool. So that's kind of what happens with Hitler, the rise of Hitler. And so you're going to read about Hitler, and you're going to read about Mussolini and these other authoritarian regimes. And to close out the chapter, okay, it talks about sort of the common things that authoritarian regimes do. And I think it's important we understand that as we go through changes in our own political system, and we look at changes in other countries around the world, and sort of formulate opinions on how to deal with them, okay, and how to recognize them. So the authoritarian regimes that arose before World War II, and that would be Hitler for sure, and Mussolini, and then way outside of World War II, getting into the 50s and 60s into South America. You know, you look at what was going on in Brazil and Venezuela and some other countries. The commonalities that these authoritarian regimes all have, and this is a quiz question, so they pretty much always say, hey, I'm going to fix the nation. And they do that whether the nation is broken or not. I mean, if you ask anyone on the street, hey, could the economy be better? People are always going to say yes, even if the economy is great, because it could always be, yeah, I could always use more, sure. So Authoritarian regimes in all of this history have always made promises like, hey, I'm going to make Germany great again, or whatever it is, all right? So that's one thing. They've all had these cult-like leaders who have usually been more like stars than brains. So in all great orators, like Hitler was a great speaker. Mussolini was a great looking guy, great speaker. So they all have that in common. All right. And the other thing they have in common is the use of violence. So their political clan usually has some violence associated with it. Maybe they're going to storm the palace, or something like that, take it over by force. That's a sort of a third thing. So look for that question on the quiz, the three kind of big features of authoritarian regimes: cult-like figure as their leader, a promise to fix things, whether they're broken or not, and the use of violence or the threats of violence to take over the opposing political party. So that's it for this week. Sorry this one was so long. It covers everything on the quiz. Have a great week. Be safe. If you have any questions, let me know. Take care now. Bye-bye.